Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to Conversations in the Digital Age. Our show is about global political risk, and here to help us analyze the major risks confronting us in 2015 is a global risk analyst. Indeed, he's one of the best in the business. He is Michael Moran. Michael Moran is a vice president of Control Risks, which is a global risk consultancy. He is an author and a commentator, and he was with us a year ago, and he was remarkably prescient in the risks that he diagnosed and analyzed for us, and he's going to do it again this year. Mike, welcome back.
Glad to be here, Jim.
Let's start at home. It's always fun to start at home, and it's appropriate, and it's quite disturbing when Les Gelb, the president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, said that Susan Rice and Dennis McDonough and our entire national security team should be fired because of Obama's failure to go to Paris for the march. Is a dysfunctional foreign policy a global risk for the United States?
No, I think dysfunction is a tough word for U.S. foreign policy. I think if you look at any president over the last 2 decades, and ask them whether they'd have a couple of do-overs. I think this is a good example of where they would love to have this again. Certainly there have been a couple in the Obama administration. What I believe is happening is that the Obama administration, which came to office promising to pull back from a very forward-leaning foreign policy, has pulled back to the extent that they've left vacuums. To some extent this was inevitable because our presence in Southwest Asia, in Afghanistan and Iraq was such a huge center of gravity there that suddenly pulling out created a vacuum which was very quickly filled by ISIS and by other bad actors. And I think the problem in U.S. foreign policy now is that it's become reactive. It's not proactive, because proactive foreign policy became almost a toxic concept after the Bush administration.
Now, what about domestic policy? Are we seeing dysfunction over the last 2 years of the Obama administration? Will the Republicans hold the line, and will the Democrats continue to challenge them, and there'll be nothing done and no meaningful legislation passed?
Well, risk analysts are noted for wallowing in gloom, but here I'm a bit optimistic, actually. I think in spite of the rhetoric, and you will not see lambs and lions lying down together, but what you will see, I think, is that incentives are aligned in such a way that the Republicans, who must go into 2016 showing some track record of governing, not merely obstructing, will have to compromise on some issues. And you're already seeing Boehner speak, the Speaker of the House, speak in terms that suggest there are compromises to be had. President Obama has really nothing to lose to act tough and to put on the table the kinds of things he would do if Congress were more compliant, especially early on in this 2-year period.
Well, he says more discretionary spending. And,
absolutely.
That's certainly a red flag before the bull.
Absolutely. The fact is, I think he feels he has the upper hand down the line when we get down to, for instance, the conference committee hearings that hash out the details of bills that get passed, budgets and appropriations bills. Ultimately, there will be a spirit of compromise. There's an indication that certainly, though the House majority for the Republicans has increased, that it is a majority that is more centrist than the previous one and more likely to fall in line when Boehner wants to cut a deal.
Okay, so let's shift from Boehner to Europe. Europe's having its economic problems now, and Ian Bremmer says our greatest geopolitical risk is that Europe will implode. Do you agree with him?
Control Risk doesn't see that as a likely possibility. We're more concerned about China's creditworthiness, its banking system, and the opaqueness of China than we are about Europe. The Greek elections Obviously, this is playing out as we speak. We don't know exactly where this is going, but it's created yet another dilemma.
The election of Alex Tsipras in Greece.
That's right.
And he says he's for austerity. So you have this macroeconomic tension between a policy of austerity for Greece and Spain and other countries that aren't doing so well, and a policy of stimulus, which is buying back all the sovereign debt. So is that really the issue?
Well, the issue is that ultimately in democratic states, austerity runs its course in terms of political realism. Electorates in Spain, in Greece, and to some extent in France as well, have reacted against austerity, which they perceive as being imposed by Germany and a select group of other Northern European countries. It points up the dilemma within the Eurozone. You have a single currency, but you have national policies in terms of fiscal policy. That is a very difficult circle to square. But our take is that Europe will muddle through this, that whether or not Greece leaves, and we don't believe it will, ultimately the EU and the Euro will hold together.
You think they'll hold together? Now, of course, Steve Ratner writes in the New York Times that the issue wasn't really austerity versus stimulus. He says the issue was red tape and an anti-business posture on the part of the EU and their tendency to be over-regulated and to stifle business. Do you agree with that?
I think that there is such a tendency, but I think that that's a piece that will go down very well in the City of London and some parts of Frankfurt. But otherwise, I think that is a tangent. It's not the main issue. The main issue is that the electorate is now weighing in on the Eurozone crisis for the first time in a real way.
Well, they don't like austerity. No one likes being unemployed, so they're exerting their political will.
Well, to Ratner's point, though, whether unemployment actually flows from austerity is another question. There was, a high level of structural unemployment in the EU even before the Eurozone crisis. It's not the same economy as the U.S. or even the Canadian economy. But I do believe that ultimately what the voters are weighing in on now are anti-austerity sentiments in many of these southern tier countries. And that, of course, is playing into the hands of some of the populist parties that also would pull issues like immigration and cultural kind of stability into the mix of electoral issues.
Now, what about this rash of nationalism in Europe and of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? I mean, is that something that could break the European Union apart?
Those are, to our view, more national problems than a EU problem. There's a huge variety across the EU of parties that would pursue, let's say, more parochial, protectionist, or even xenophobic policies. None of them really are in a position of government. Even the parties in Spain, which probably polling the highest right now among these populist parties, and the Greek party that just came to power, these are not necessarily xenophobic parties. These are parties that are taking a new look at the basic compact of the EU, the question of whether or not Greek national interests or Spanish national interests or Catalan national interests, if you want to get really into the weeds in Spain, should take a back seat to this larger European project, which is increasingly dominated by the largest economy in the EU, and that's Germany. You're seeing it in the UK with the UK IP party as well. The reality is none of these parties really are in power right now. It's possible that Spain's Podemos will actually come to power, but once in power, you immediately see that the rhetoric of the campaign trail meets the reality of fiscal responsibilities, of the treaty responsibilities that a country has taken on, and it's a really big leap from from that campaign rhetoric to a position where you're really negotiating the exit from the EU. We just don't see it.
But what about anti-Semitism? I mean, you see clearly anti-Semitic leader in Hungary. You see in France the attack on the kosher grocery store, Hyper Kasher. You see reportedly more and more Jews wanting to emigrate from France to Israel because they fear for their lives. Is that something that is really destructive and you see as a risk?
Well, it's clearly, these are national level problems. They are not imagined, clearly. Some of this, of course, is projected, is the Middle East conflict projected onto European countries. But there is also endemic, organic anti-Semitism, and that includes the United States. This is a problem that every society wrestles with. I don't believe that it's worse now than it has been. It's simply that global events and trends and the atmosphere within the EU particularly, where the very basic contract that's been made between European countries and the post-war world is being questioned, all of these things have allowed a kind of dialogue to come to the surface that might have been taboo in the past. And so we're seeing in Mao's terms, 1,000 flowers blooming. And hopefully with the anti-Semites, they chop the heads off.
Well, except we're seeing there violent attacks against Jews, which you don't see in the United States. So the problem is certainly more aggravated in Europe than it is here.
We do see that, but there's no lack of hate crime in the United States if you look at FBI statistics. Whether it's directed at Jews or those who have different views on their gender, all of these things are national level issues that societies must grapple with nationally, and they become much more exacerbated when a kind of global issue like the Middle East peace process or the Middle East conflict is then projected onto these societal issues.
So let's turn to terrorism, which is certainly a major issue. Leon Panetta predicts a terrorist attack on the United States. He said this right after the events in Paris in January. Do you see that as a significant risk?
We do not rank that as a significant risk, but we also don't rule out the fact that the Black Swan events happen. I don't know where Mr. Panetta is getting his information. I mean, we talked earlier about the fact that those who forecast often, take aggressive stands because those forecasts will be forgotten if nothing happens, and yet you look like a genius if it has. I'm sure that's not why Mr. Panetta is saying this, but we don't particularly rate that forecast as likely. We see always the possibility that that some kind of inspired Al-Qaeda or locally cooked up plot by disgruntled people could take place. But right now, the big attack is it's an unknowable, but we don't see it.
Let's turn to the dramatic decline in the price of oil and how that's affected world economies and world markets, and indeed world currencies, which has already impacted the profits of multinationals. How do you see that as playing out?
Well, our view, and this is in tandem with our joint venture partner Oxford Economics, is that the dive below $50 is not sustainable. The Saudis, of course, could sustain this if they wanted to. We don't believe they want to in the long run.
What do you mean by not sustainable?
OPEC is a cartel that has many disparate members who are in deep pain because of the decision led by the Saudis to continue to pump at the levels before their last meeting in November. This has angered the Iranians, particularly. The Saudis and the Iranians are not on particularly good terms, as you may know. But it's also hurt very seriously the Venezuelans. It's hurt the Algerians, the Angolans, the Nigerians,
and the Russians.
Productions, and of course the Russians, who again the Saudis are not particularly pleased with because of their support for Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So what we're seeing, though, is an effort to bring supply to a situation where market share can be recaptured in some cases by some of these OPEC countries. It's lost in the weeds here is the fact that Nigeria, Angola, and all these African producers who used to export a great deal of oil to the United States have been completely displaced by shale oil. It's light crude. Light crude and refineries need light crude to refine. So that's what shale produced. So last year, for the first time, I believe, in 3 decades, no oil was imported by the United States from Nigeria. That means Nigeria's oil is out on the market looking for new places to land. Similarly, Iran, which is moving its way toward, hopefully, some kind of accommodation on its nuclear program, has an awful lot of oil sitting in the wings, which would contribute to the glut that currently exists. So while we see prices staying low for a while, we don't see it being engineered so much by OPEC as by global conditions. China slowing down, Europe somewhat stagnant in terms of its growth. Really, the emerging markets altogether really growing much less quickly than it was just 5 years ago. Only the United States and the UK to some extent really growing at a healthy rate.
So we're seeing increased supply, or certainly level supply levels, the ones that were always there. We're also seeing curtailed demand, particularly from China and other, Japan, other big consumers of oil.
Right, and an important geopolitical point here. Since the late 60s, Saudi Arabia has been the swing producer of the world. In other words,
the largest producer in the world.
But also the producer that has reserve production, that it's not even producing. It can go another, it can ramp up or turn down its production in a way that actually affects global markets. That's a unique position until shale. So whatever, simplistic story is being told about the Saudis going after shale, the reality is the United States has now joined the Saudis in the position of being a swing producer. Because even if shale projects slow and are mothballed for a while, when the price gets to a certain level again, they will ramp up again. And the United States now has shown it has the ability to pump almost as much oil as the Saudis. So the Saudis, in many ways, are also protecting their position as the swing producer, as the market maker in the oil markets.
So do you see the price coming back in the near term?
I think, well, frankly, it's a good news story for most of the world, so let's not rush it. But I think the price will probably come back. Our partners at Oxford see 65 to 75 probably within 18 months.
Within 18 months.
Yeah.
Now, you've mentioned Saudi a number of times. We just saw the death of King Abdullah, and he, of course, has a successor, the Crown Prince, King Salman. Do you regard Salman as the strong leader that Abdullah was?
Well, I'm not a Saudi. I'm not exactly sure how you would say this. I'm not an expert.
Saudophile.
I'm an observer of Saudi Arabia. We have noticed, and our analysts in Saudi Arabia have written about the smoothness of the transition. Obviously, it's been remarked that we've now seeing the second generation of Sauds, of ancestors joining the top levels of the Saudi monarchy. These are all indications that the transition went as planned, that the status quo is likely to prevail for a long time. In terms of the politics of Saudi Arabia, we do see oil and the oil price and its desire to stay in the catbird seat in the oil markets as the driving force behind policy for Saudi Arabia and for OPEC, which Saudi Arabia, by definition, dominates. So it's essentially a continuity at this point. We're not seeing a great deal of change.
So do you think Salman's going to continue the stability-first policies of Abdullah? You remember he opposed free elections because he was concerned that if you had free elections, Islamic fundamentalists, the Islamic Brotherhood, would prevail. And he's allied himself with Egypt, pumped billions of dollars into Egypt to sustain Sisi's regime there. Do you see all that continuing?
We've seen no indication that there'll be a radical change in Saudi foreign policy. But importantly, we've also seen and noted that the GCC in general, Saudi, UAE, Qatar, are acting much more independently than in the past, in part because of the absence of U.S. power in the region. They are getting much more involved in the regional situation, and you see this most importantly in the air war against ISIS.
Now, we heard a lot about the Arab Spring a few years ago. There was supposed to be a big movement toward democracy in the Middle East, and the Arab Spring seems to have fizzled. Is the Arab Spring just a canard? I mean, the only countries that seem to have come out all right are Tunisia and maybe one or two others, but most of them have continued to be in disarray.
Well, Tunisia, of course, can't be discounted. It's a model. It now is a model for the Arab world on how Islam and democracy can coexist. It's early days, obviously. Libya, Syria, the turmoil in Egypt, which has led to really a reinstitution of the system that was there in the beginning. These are all situations that suggest that simply wanting democracy and overthrowing a despot is not enough, that you have to have civil society developed behind it. And to some extent, the countries that are best placed to do these things will struggle the most because civil society can be co-opted as well. So we've seen that the Arab Spring, of course, is now essentially the Arab turmoil. It's almost a counter-revolution now you've seen in the Arab Spring. And you've got significant civil unrest and civil war in Syria, risks of that war spilling into neighboring Jordan and Lebanon, and of course already in Western Iraq. So the real focus now is that while these revolutions showed that there is a genuine Arab street that demands democracy, those factions may not necessarily represent a majority, and those factions can unleash forces, particularly when the superpower has just essentially pulled out from the region. That can lead to real chaos and has to be contained. And we're seeing now a return to this kind of containment.
Well, what about Yemen, where the Shia faction, the Houthis, just overthrew the government in Sana'a, the capital city? And Yemen is, of course, the hometown of al-Qaeda. So is this going to really do violence to our counterterrorism strategy in Yemen?
Well, to the extent that the Yemeni government was an ally in pursuing counterterrorist goals in Yemen, yes, absolutely. It's a major concern for Saudi Arabia as well. Saudi Arabia has over the years spent a great deal of time, money, and blood in Yemen. But the country is, remember, was two countries only a few decades ago. The reconciliation has never fully taken hold, and the Houthis, while they now seem to be in a dominant position, have not shown their cards, really. I wouldn't rush to judge what's coming out of this. They don't seem particularly eager to pick a fight outside their borders right now, though we know, of course, that there are factions within Yemen which are quite happy to export terrorism to the West.
Well, quickly, let's pivot to the Pacific. Tell us about China and Japan. What do you see happening there?
Well, in terms of the maritime dispute that's there, we look at that as obviously a tripwire to some extent, but one that's unlikely to lead to major conflict. What's more likely there, and what we are concerned about, is that accidentally we could see some of these junior naval officers who were involved in playing chicken around these shoals and islets make a mistake that escalates to the point where things freeze up in that area. Why is that important? Obviously, it has the potential to pull in the 7th Fleet in defense of Japan, but we don't think it's going to go there. What really would hurt would be that 1/3 of the world's supply chains run through that region. Businesses all over the world depend on resources and components that have to make their way through those waters. If that should freeze up for a month or even two, it could really hurt the global economy. And so we've been counseling clients to really look at alternative sources should that scenario ever play out.
So in the coming year, do you see increased tensions between China and Japan?
We're not looking at this as an escalation that is deliberate. There's a lot of rhetoric. It's a very difficult relationship for historical reasons. Neither is inclined in front of its own public to back down. However,
difficult relationship. I have a question for you because we're rapidly running out of time. Michael Moran, what is our greatest global risk in 2015?
In 2015, the greatest global risk is that we really don't understand what's going on in the Chinese economy, and that its banking system is still sufficiently opaque that it could pose a risk to global growth.
Well, we better study that and look at it very closely. Michael Moran, thank you for coming by. That was just wonderful. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best and take care.